Today in the epistle we heard from the second letter of Paul to Timothy, and in this letter Paul is coming to the end of his life and he's writing to his young protege Timothy, and among the things he says to him to give him sort of direction for his future, he says, "The time is coming when people will not put up with sound doctrine, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own desires." Some people think it's always that time, even now. But what is this business of sound doctrine? Sound doctrine, that's what I want to look at. It's just that phrase, sound doctrine. And I want to look at it in light of today's feast of St. Peter and St. Paul, and also with one last look at the Council of Nicaea and the Nicene Creed and how they all relate to what is sound doctrine. So several years ago, Sharon and I had the chance to spend some time in Rome, and before we left Erie, I found out that the Willises, yes, those Willises, were going to be in Rome at the same time we were, and that our visit was going to overlap by one day. So Sharon and Cindy exchanged some texts about this, and Cindy said, "We will meet you in St. Peter's Square." Now, St. Peter's Square, I think, is the largest square in the world. And when it's full of for some grand event, it can hold tens of thousands of people. But you know what? We were only there a few minutes, and we ran into Cindy and George and Floss. And we had a wonderful night in Rome together with them and with Ben. Sharon and I, that time, we had an apartment not too far from St. Peter's Square, and we went there every night before we went back to settle in for the night. And it's very quiet at night, beautiful, dark. There's fountains there, and so there's the sound of fountains. It's a very, very peaceful place to be at that time of the day. But whatever time of the day you were there, in St. Peter's Square are two very large statues, one of St. Peter and one of St. Paul. Nowadays, the base of the statue is a video screen, so that people who are out in those big crowds can see through the video screen a little more closely what's going on up front. But the statues of Peter and Paul. St. Peter's Square is outside of St. Peter's Basilica. In St. Peter's Basilica, the altar, the main altar in the Basilica, is actually built over the tomb of St. Peter. And archaeologists are pretty sure it really is the place. Outside of the old city of Rome, outside the walls, is another huge basilica, the Basilica of St. Paul. And archaeologists are pretty sure that the altar in the Basilica of St. Paul, outside the walls, as it's called, is built over the tomb of St. Paul, or at least pretty close to where that tomb would have been. So when you see all of this, these huge basilicas named after Peter and Paul, and the statues, and you know that their tombs are there, and you think of all this centuries of people coming and going from those places, it all seems really solemn and serious. And it's not surprising that Rome became identified because both Peter and Paul were martyred there, and Peter was the bishop there. It's not surprising that Rome became identified as a place to look to for sound doctrine, for good teaching. It also helped that it was the capital of the empire. And when you look at all of those things that still remain, the basilicas, the statues, the tombs, all of the people coming and going, as I said, it seems very serious and very solemn. And one has the picture of doctrine being carved out by very serious scholarly leaders who are contemplating quietly and deep in prayer and coming up with sound doctrine for the church. Until we remember what Peter and Paul were really like. Today's gospel, Peter is asked 3 times by Jesus, "Do you love me?" This deliberately parallels the 3 times that Peter denied Jesus in the most crucial moment when Jesus was undergoing the trial that would lead to his execution. And Peter denied that he knew him 3 times during that trial. The risen Jesus gives Peter 3 chances to overcome that, to say, I love you 3 times. That's because of what he did before. And Paul was a Roman citizen, highly educated, and he persecuted Christians. He hunted them down to be imprisoned and executed until he ran into the risen Jesus and his life turned around. That's who we're talking about. Human people full of flaws. And the book of Galatians, the letter that Paul writes to the Galatians, is so fascinating. We didn't hear from it today, but we have been a little bit the last couple of weeks. This is a letter where Paul talks about 2 times that he was actually with Peter. And this is not someone making up a story years after the event. This is Paul writing about his own experience and how he went to Jerusalem and he met with Peter and with James, the Lord's brother, and they compared their experiences of the risen Christ, and they sort of agreed who would do what in the mission of the church. That's one time. The second time, Peter and Paul are in Antioch, and they are having a face-to-face, full-out battle and argument in front of everybody. I remember the former dean of San Francisco said, conflict and arguments have been part of the tradition of the church from the very beginning. And so here's Peter and Paul having a big argument with each other right in front of the rest of the church. The issue was, as more and more people were coming to believe in Jesus who were not Jews, did they have to adopt Jewish practices in order to be part of the church? That was the issue. It was a burning issue. No one had really thought about that before, and it was a new question. And in this event, Peter was kind of on one side and Paul was on the other, and they were arguing it out. Eventually, in the Acts of the Apostles, we read how the disciples came together in Jerusalem, and James, Jesus' brother, was presiding, and they hammered out a pragmatic compromise on this issue that said that the Gentiles were welcome in the church with the Jews. They didn't have to become Jews in order to be Christians. They just keep a few things that would not be offensive to Jewish people, and that would work. The point is, all of this, the most important question in the early church, was not hammered out by scholars sitting in their studies, prayerfully writing out what would be sound doctrine. It came out of a very human life struggle. And it had to do with how we live. Same kind of thing happens in 325, 1700 years ago, that we recognize along with so many Christians this year. The Council of Nicaea was called by the emperor to resolve the question, the burning question of the day. How do we understand Jesus? Is he God? Is he human? Is he some mixture of the two that isn't one or the other? The leading contender that was most popular at the time was giving the view that Jesus was almost God, but not quite. He was like God, but only God is God. So Jesus has to be maybe like just a step below God, but not like God. St. Nicholas, yep, that's St. Nicholas. He was at the Council of Nicaea, the bishop from Turkey at the time, and he was, according to the story, so angry at this guy when he was presenting his views in the council that he just went across the room and smacked him. St. Nicholas. Most people think that's a legend. It didn't really happen, but the fact that it's even a legend shows how contentious things were about that issue at that council. This was not a lot of calm, contemplative bishops sitting down and quietly working out what would be a sound doctrine for the church. They were fighting over it in order to find it. is the way it happens. Sound doctrine is not about a list of intellectual items that we check off and say, I intellectually accept that that's true. Number two, I believe that's also true. Yes, I agree with all those things. That's not what doctrine's about. If it were, then Jesus would have been a philosopher like Plato and Aristotle. And he would have come out of his study one day with something that's like the Nicene Creed and said, here, believe this. This is what I came for, was to tell you what you're supposed to believe. It's not what happened. He was the love of God embodied in a human being, living our life and dying our death, and then rising from the dead, and then giving us a place to turn to, so that sound doctrine that we wrestle out of that is not primarily an intellectual thing, checking off ideological boxes. It's less like that, and it's more like trusting that we are part of a great story of love. That's what sound doctrine is. So let's be thankful today for the very flawed, messy, imperfect human lives of people like Peter and Paul, St. Nicholas, all of those who gathered at the Council of Nicaea, all of the church ever since, right up to our own day, right up even to us, who have been given the gift of sound doctrine.